This is the Sports Bash Warm-Up with Josh Hennig on 97.3 ESPN. Now, live inside the Matt Black Kia Studios, here's Josh Hennig.
The reason their record was what it was at home versus on the road is because it's a young team. And with Jimmy Butler and J.J. Redick not being anymore, not having that veteran presence, like, young teams, you hear about that all the time. They're great when they're in front of their crowd. They're not battle-tested or strong enough to go somewhere else and take it from somebody. And unfortunately, as much progress we thought the Sixers made, what we saw this year, they didn't really do it.
That was Daryl Reynolds on the Sports Bash yesterday here on 97.3 ESPN. He's the co-host of the Process podcast, also a member of the Villanova 2016 National Championship team. I am Josh Hennig here on the warm-up on 97.3 ESPN. Here we are talking about the Sixers again. Seems just this team, just whether they're playing or not, they're always there for us to talk about. And I appreciate them for that. 609-403-0973 is the text number to get on the conversation. Coming up in about 25 minutes from now, Ben Golliver, national NBA writer for the Washington Post, covering the NBA for a long time. You've heard him here a few times in the last couple months. We'll be getting into with him about the 76ers and the NBA's plans to return, because there's a lot of conjecture, a lot of moving parts going on right now. And, of course, we take your text messages at 609-403-0973. Daryl Reynolds mentioned there in that audio piece about the fact that on the Sports Bash, he was telling the guys the fact that the Sixers are missing some veteran leadership, the fact that this is a young basketball team, it's very interesting because on one hand, you would assume that you signed Al Horford for that veteran leadership. But on the flip side, he pointed, Daryl Reynolds, to Jimmy Butler and J.J. Redick. And maybe there's something to be said for the fact that you can sign a veteran, but he may not be the right veteran for a basketball team. And when you look at a young team, and if you're going to say that because of their youth and because of their maturity, that has a huge impact on the basketball team's ability to win on the road and have a successful playoff run, then I have to wonder, at what point do we just look at the Sixers and say this is not their year? At what point do we actually have the conversation about the Sixers where we just say maybe it's just not their year? Maybe they're just not built adequately to win a championship. And I think back to all the conversations that we've had here on 97.3 ESPN, from myself to Mike Gild, Hunter Brody, even Billy Schweim on his show on Saturday mornings, 10 a.m. to noon, before me on Sports Bash Saturday on 97.3 ESPN. We've all asked the question, is this a championship team? Is this a team that can win an NBA championship? And, we've all looked at game by game, month by month, the ebb and flow of the season, the evolution of the team each offseason, or de-evolution in some cases. And I really just have to wonder, at some point, do we just have to say, this is not a championship team? If the NBA goes to one of the suggested ideas is ranking all the teams 1 through 16, right? That instead of having Eastern Conference and Western Conference playoff setup, that all 16 playoff teams would just play each other, and the winner of that would win the NBA title this year. Well, that becomes even more of a problem for the Sixers. Because when you look at the Sixers versus other teams around the league, if you take away, the conference record and all that stuff, of course, the Sixers are 26-16 in their conference. That means on the season, the 76ers are 13-10 versus the West. So it is not just a home versus away situation anymore. This is a potential, maybe you're just not good enough to win a championship. I know it's been suggested multiple times that the 76ers were built to beat the Bucks, right? We've heard multiple people say that on television, on the Sports Bash with Mike Gill, and on numerous other shows about how this team was built to handle the length and the athleticism of the Bucks. And we know the Sixers have had success this year versus the Celtics. But when you take away those teams, when you take away those scenarios, and for example, look at some of the teams in the Western Conference, Clippers, Nuggets, the Jazz, the Rockets. Do the Sixers really match up against those teams very well? Heck, look at the Portland Trail Blazers. There's a lot of speculation right now that the Portland Trail Blazers could have the opportunity to get themselves into the postseason by playing in. And if they get in the postseason, in whatever form it is, whether it's a play-in, or if the NBA says instead of bringing 16 teams to Orlando, we're going to bring 20 teams to Orlando, and we're going to give everybody a shot at potentially playing in like they're doing right now with the NHL proposed model. Do you think the Sixers really match up well versus a team with Damian Lillard, CJ McCollum, a healthy and recovered Yusuf Nurkic, a potentially rested Carmelo Anthony? That Portland Trail Blazers team is dangerous. I would argue of all the teams in that lower half of the West, the Mavs, the Grizzlies, Portland, and the Pelicans, of those four teams, if you're the Sixers and you got to get into this, there's no conference format, and you got to play a team like Portland, that worries me. Memphis, listen, Memphis is a nice young team, but they're not as dangerous as Portland would be in a 5 or 7 game series. Dallas would be dangerous, but I think the Sixers could maybe figure out a way to beat them just because of the fact that after Luka Doncic and Kristaps Porzingis, there was a drop-off in some of the offensive firepower that the Dallas has. Rockets have a lot of offensive firepower. They might not play a lot of defense, but they have a lot of offensive firepower. You know, you don't average 118 points a game for nothing. So if you're the Sixers, at what point do we just have the conversation that as constructed, this team may not be a championship team? 609-403-0973. And if they're not a championship team, and they're not a team that can win it all right here, right now, then what does that mean for the offseason? An offseason that is, as for all intents and purposes, going to be completely different than anything we've ever seen in the NBA. An offseason in which you could potentially only have 2-month gap from the end of the NBA Finals to the next training camp. If things play out as we expect them to, has been laid out by all the NBA insiders and reporters out there, if the NBA Finals concludes at the end of September, you would have October and November for your offseason. Instead of having potentially 3 and 4 months gap from the end of the finals to the next season, you would cut that in half. How would that affect the Sixers' decision making? How would that affect what they do in the draft, in free agency, in the offseason with trades? How does that affect their potential of maybe considering a new head coach? Are you more or less likely to move on from Brett Brown if you have less time in your offseason? These are all questions that have to be asked. You know, everyone has questions about a lot of things when it comes to how teams are coming back, how teams are going to handle, you know, an environment with this pandemic, if players are okay with taking tests. We've gotten all those answers at this point. Yeah, there's some minor addendums that have to be addressed still, but the majority of the questions that are being asked, there's an answer to them, whether it's directly from the NBA or what we're seeing from other sports, whether it's in this country or in other parts of the world, whether it's the Korean Baseball League or Bundesliga or wherever it may be. You know, the UFC has got a fight card tomorrow night and then next weekend as well. Golf is coming back in a couple of weeks. NASCAR has been racing. So we have ideas of how this will work when the team sports do come back. My question, though, is the impact all of this is going to have on the teams moving forward. And of the 4 Philadelphia teams, the Eagles, the Sixers, the Flyers, and the Phillies, one could make the argument that this environment that we're in, this pandemic, everything that's happened with COVID-19 and the state situations and every state being different and everything that's going on, the fact that we haven't had team sports in 2 months, I would argue that the Sixers are the greatest impacted team by all this. Because we all put the onus on this season as we're going to find out what this team is made of. We're going to find out if Brett Brown should or shouldn't be the head coach moving forward. We're going to find out all these things about the league. And now, because of this pandemic and because of the fact that the NBA is going to push off their season to what looks like the end of July, when we would actually resume meaningful basketball games. You know, they'll probably have an X number of scrimmages probably in the middle of July to get ready. And depending on who you ask, it's probably going to take 3 or 4 weeks for them to even get ramped up and ready to play those scrimmage games before they play the games that matter. I think this negatively impacts the Sixers more than any other Philly team. Because for the Eagles, they haven't even started their season yet. The NFL can just sit and wait for the rest of the world to do their thing before they even get back on the field. They don't have to come back for mini camps or any off-season activities later in the month of June, as some people have suggested. Major League Baseball, they haven't started their season, and frankly, I'm not even sure if there will be a baseball season. And if there is a baseball season, we're probably going to all look at baseball and not even take it, too seriously, not because that we don't want our team to win or because the games don't matter, but because of the fact that at the end of the season, they're just going to have more conversations about the collective bargaining agreement and all that stuff. If baseball comes back, and let's say the players get their way, they get their prorated salaries, they get a 100-game season. Well, 100 games from July start, whatever in July, and I'm going to assume that they won't start July 2nd or 4th just because of the way things are going right now in their negotiations. But I digress. 100 games from July still puts you in the depths of the fall, close to the start of winter. And if baseball then ends their season somewhere, let's say in November, getting close to December, getting close to Thanksgiving, then again shortens baseball's offseason. And it feels like we're just going to have the same conversations we're having now about money and about logistics and all that stuff. But for the 76ers, the NBA season was supposed to be the catalyst, the pathway to get them back to the postseason for them to prove their worth. And now you could have a situation where you're not playing some of the Eastern Conference teams that you purposely built this team to contend with. You may never see the Bucks in the playoffs. If the standings get shuffled even one iota from what they are now, you might not even see the Celtics in the playoffs. You might see teams that have given you trouble this year. You might have to see the Miami Heat in the playoffs. You might have to see the Toronto Raptors in the playoffs. And if you're 13-10 versus the Western Conference, and you got to play a team like the Clippers or the Nuggets or the Rockets or the Trailblazers in this new revamped playoff format, I'm not very confident the Sixers are going to beat those teams in a 5 or 7 game series. And it's not because Joel Embiid isn't phenomenally talented. It's not because Ben Simmons can't play good defense and, when push comes to shove, execute the way they need to. It's because I just am unsure if this team is built as constructed to win a championship. Because for all intents and purposes, the Al Horford project has not panned out the way it should have. Josh Richardson has had some nice moments, but he's not an elite NBA player. When you look at the NBA, you realize that the 76ers may just be outgunned. And if they're outgunned, Do we just shrug our shoulders and say it's another year of disappointment? You know, this organization accelerated the process under Brian Colangelo. And then everything blew up in Colangelo's face, and then everything got handed over to Elton Brand. And Elton Brand has made numerous roster changes, from trading for Jimmy Butler, to trading for Tobias Harris, to moving on from Butler, to bringing in Al Horford. Constant change and constant reshuffling is not helping the chemistry and the development of this organization and this team to win a championship. And you can point to the fact that you're 1 or 2 bounces away from reaching the Eastern Conference Finals last year versus the Raptors. But even if you reach the conference finals, there's no guarantee you would have beaten the Bucks. There's no guarantee that you would be in the NBA Finals. There's no guarantees in life. I can't spend all my time saying, well, if this would have happened. No. I only can work with what I know. And what I know is that if this team is in an environment where there's no fans and they have 29 wins based on a home crowd, and let's say there's a certain number of those wins they won just because of that home crowd, and you're telling me that a 39-26 team overall has 26 of those 39 wins versus the Eastern Conference, and the NBA is considering reshuffling the entire postseason and the potential of you having to face a Western Conference team in the NBA playoffs, I do not have confidence in this team. I get it, they're young. I get it, they're developing. I get it, how talented they are. But sometimes you just run into a wall because it's not your season. It happened to Michael Jordan. It happened to LeBron James. It happened to every talented player you can pull up that's not named Magic Johnson. The majority of superstars and talented athletes, when they enter the league, have to go through growing pains before they win a championship. And the Sixers are no different, whether we like it or not. 609-403-0973. Again, Ben Golliver, National NBA Writer, will be joining us coming up in about 8 minutes from now. We'll talk more about the NBA and about the Sixers. We'll get your text messages first, 609-403-0973. Dan from Tuckerton has a suggestion of what the NBA should do. He says they should end the NBA regular season. Take 12 teams from the East, 12 teams from the West. Top 4 seeds get a bye. 5 through 12 do a best-of-3 series. East Coast plays at Disney. West Coast plays at Vegas. Give the teams 2 weeks of practice before it all starts. All right, Dan. So I'm going to play a little devil's advocate with your text and nitpick a little bit. First of all, I don't know if it's fair to take the top 12 teams from the East, because I'm going to tell you the teams that are 9, 10, 11, and 12. The 21-45 Knicks, the 22-43 Bulls, the 23-42 Hornets, and then the 24-40 Wizards. And the Wizards themselves are 5.5 games out of the 8th seed. Now, if you're bringing those 12 teams from the East, those teams I just mentioned, because you're having to fulfill regional sports network agreements and you're having to maximize the television and advertising revenue that was promised, I'm on board with it. But if you're ending the regular season and you're taking 4 teams that have already proven that they are not deserving of a playoff opportunity, I'm not on board with that, Dan. But if you're bringing the teams with you in order to solidify the owed contracts, I can work with that. Now, you say East Coast plays at Disney, West Coast plays at Vegas. The problem with that theory you have, while it sounds great in theory, and it was a theory that I agree with originally, here's what we know. The NBA has already entered conversations with Walt Disney World of doing everything in one spot. There have not been any reported extensive conversations with the people in Vegas about it. It's looking more and more like everyone's going to go to the ESPN Worldwide Sports Campus at Disney. and you say give teams 2 weeks to practice before it all starts. I'm leaning toward the 3 to 4 week ramp up. And the reason why I'm leaning toward that, Dan and Tuckerton, is because I think that for the NBA, they need more time to get these players conditioned. I don't think every player has been 100% staying in shape. It's impossible to have every guy in 100% shape when it comes to an elongated offseason, let alone a shutdown in the middle of a pandemic when a good majority of these guys can't even get on regular basketball courts and do sprints and shoot jumpers. I think you're going to need 4 weeks. But Dan, I like the fact that you put your name on it, you put your idea out there, and you have an idea, and you believe in something, and I'm all for that, and I like you for that. Another text in here, 609-403-0973. Tom from the Village chimes in and says, is this team a move or two away from a title, or are we starting to talk about the process being a failure? First of all, I don't think the process was a failure. I think that the point of the process, in my opinion, is that you took multiple shots at the lottery and you walked away with Embiid and Simmons. You traded away Okafor, you traded away Noel, and you moved on from Fultz. I think that walking away with Embiid and Simmons is proof that the Sixers' goal of the process was to get legitimate talent in the top of the draft and to make themselves relevant again. So in that manner, the process got you what you wanted from it. I do think this team is a move or two away from a title. What move or two that is, I can't 100% tell you or promise you that one move is going to result in something good or another, Tom from the Villas. I do think that if you want to say the team is, let's say they are 2 moves away from a title, I think you have to give strong consideration to moving on from Al Horford and refurbishing this roster a little bit. Unless you're going to change your style of play completely under a new head coach. In that case, you bring in a new head coach to change the style of play when it comes to the offense. Now, when it comes to the head coach, that might be the other move that you have to make that gets you to a title. Maybe Brett Brown isn't the right coach for this team. Maybe Brett Brown isn't the guy to get them over the top. You know, how many times did we see in the Last Dance? Well, it was Doug Collins before it was Phil Jackson. And it was Del Harris with the Lakers and Kurt Rambis before Phil Jackson came in with the Lakers and won. And that it was Mark Jackson with the Warriors before Steve Kerr in Golden State. And that they fired Dwayne Casey despite his success of getting the postseason each and every year. They brought in Nick Nurse. They won a championship. Maybe, just maybe, one of the moves is bringing in a coach. And it has less to do with Brett Brown being a good or bad head coach than the fact that sometimes change shakes things up and forces everybody to maybe get in line and a new voice is needed. I'm not advocating for that, but I'm just saying maybe that is one of the 2 moves away from getting you into the NBA Finals. Good text, Tom from the Villas. Coming up next, Ben Golliver to talk more about the NBA next here on the warm-up. Josh Hennig here, hanging out with you. Get to more of your text messages a little bit later this hour, 609-403-0973. Here on 97.3 ESPN FM and the 97.3 ESPN mobile app, powered by First Bank of Sea Isle City. Josh Hennig back here on the warm-up on 97.3 ESPN. We'll get back to your text messages a little bit later in this hour. Keep them coming at 609-403-0973. But right now, as promised, joining us on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline, Ben Golliver, national NBA writer for the Washington Post, joins us here on 97.3 ESPN. Ben, appreciate you jumping back on. How you doing?
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm doing all right. How are you guys?
We're doing all right. So one of the things I want to get in with you today, aside from what's going on with the NBA resuming the season, is, you know, we talked a little about the Sixers the last time you were on. And we've heard a few people say this week here on 97.3 ESPN about the fact that one of the things that they look at the Sixers is that if the NBA does resume, we know there's not going to be fans. What do you think the impact is going to be on a team like the Sixers that won 29 games with a home crowd to have 0 of that crowd behind them in a very, for lack of a better term, neutral environment?
Right. Well, you could look at it the other way too, right? This is a team that had tons of road struggles, and now you don't have to worry about going to play in, in a Milwaukee or a Toronto or a Boston, and maybe that winds up giving them a little bit of advantage. I mean, I think it's very difficult to handicap. I would guess though that the teams that have the best chemistry, internally, are going to be the ones that wind up coming through what's a very adverse situation the best. It's always difficult to measure that from the outside looking in, but I looked at two teams like the Lakers and the Bucks as having excellent chemistry this season. And I think, if you're being thrown together in a training camp, if you're trying to pick up where you left off, if everybody had good vibes heading out, they're probably going to have good vibes coming back in. So I think those are some of the factors that we should be considering. But look, we've never seen a situation like this before at all. I mean, the only time there's neutral site games basically is Summer League. During the playoffs, the crowd and the home court advantage is a massive factor. We see it every single year in every single series. So this idea that everyone's going to Disney World and playing in an empty gym, it's not really something that we have a precedent for in any way.
So you mentioned about team chemistry. Do you think the Sixers have enough chemistry then to legitimately make a run at the playoffs? Or do you think that as constructed, this team is just not ready to make that kind of run?
Well, you watch these guys. What do you think? I mean, they don't look like a very good chemistry bunch to me. I mean, they don't have bad guys. It's not like they're at war with each other. But I think ultimately, is the whole greater than the sum of the parts? That's not what we saw this year. There's a lot of talent on this team, a lot of, fairly big names and big contracts. Did they get everything possible out of that available talent? Did they live up to expectations? Flat out, no. They're one of the biggest disappointments in the entire league, them and the Houston Rockets, until they started shaking things up at the trade deadline down in Houston. So I don't personally view them as being a top chemistry team. I'd love for them to prove me wrong. I'd love for guys like Joel Embiid, who does a lot of talking about where he should be in terms of MVP candidates and Defensive Player of the Year candidates and things like that. I'd love for him to, come out of this quarantine and show the same kind of leadership on the court that he's done showing it off the court, which has been phenomenal in terms of what he was doing for the Sixers employees and everything else. But at this point, it doesn't look to me like a group that's, near the top of the standings in that category.
One of the conversations we have a lot in this area, because a lot of the fans in this area, they look at Brett Brown, they point at him as the problem. And we saw in the Last Dance documentary about how it was mentioned, before Phil Jackson, there was Doug Collins. And we know before Phil got to Los Angeles, it was Del Harris and Kurt Rambis. And we all know about the situation of the Warriors, Mark Jackson before Steve Kerr. So is potentially one of the ways of this team moving forward after this season is changing the head coach from Brett Brown to somebody else?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've heard that talk about Brett Brown's job security for a few years now. And I think sometimes, if there's smoke, there's fire, and, it just kind of lingers, and that's always going to be a question there. I mean, I think ultimately someone has to be responsible for the disappointment of this season if they wind up going out, say, in the first round. To me, their baseline should have been the conference finals for this year based on their talent and based on the investment that they made in players last summer. I mean, that should have been the target. And they were not on track to reach that target by any stretch, before the shutdown. Whether you want to blame Brett Brown or look at whether the pieces fit and maybe it's a front office issue, I think that's a debate that's very healthy, and you could definitely have that. I'm not sure exactly what he was supposed to do. I mean, part of the deal is you need to have a lot more shooting and a lot more spacing and some better fits among your main pieces than Philadelphia's had. And I don't know exactly how you can kind of coach your way or scheme your way out of some of those fundamental problems. But at the same time, if he's gone next year, it wouldn't surprise me in the slightest.
Ben Golliver joining us, the Boardwalk Honda Hotline on 97.3 ESPN Washington Post, national NBA writer. And Ben, in your latest article for the Washington Post, you finished the article talking about how Adam Silver is facing the biggest challenge of his tenure. And the biggest takeaway I had from that part of your article at the end was, do you think Adam Silver is the right man for the job in this environment?
Of course, absolutely. I mean, I think he's done a great job as commissioner. I would say this, though. I mean, he could be acting a little bit more proactively than he has right now in this particular moment. I think he's so concerned with weighing all options and trying to do what's in the greater good and making sure everybody feels heard that sometimes he winds up, being a little overly deliberate, a little bit overly cautious. What I would do if I was asked by Adam Silver, and he would not need my advice, but I would say this: go back to that Donald Sterling incident, right, where he basically banishes Sterling from the NBA, and that was a situation where he was very forceful, where he acted quickly, where he did the right thing, and where the audience, fans, players, owners, and everybody gave him huge kudos for those aggressive moves, for sticking his neck out. And look, there was some real downside risk to doing that. There was the potential for legal ramifications, for the NBA getting sued and everything else. And yet Adam Silver, was a very forceful leader in that moment. I think that's what's needed right now, too. I mean, I don't want to get too much into politics and all that, but if you look around the country, I think there's a lot of people who are just sort of wanting some clear communication and clear leadership from people who are authority figures. And I think for the NBA's whole conversation this week to be, are we going to do a 16-team bracket or a 20-team bracket or a World Cup thing, or are we going to have, these agents are upset about, not having good enough hotels down in Orlando, and these players are upset about maybe being excluded from the playoff situation, everything else. I just think that whole conversation is a little bit toxic. It's damaging to the sport. And I think that Adam Silver could kind of get things back on track here by acting forcefully and just, laying out, hey, here's how the playoffs are going to work. And if you get your feelings hurt by those, those formats, so be it. That's part of the situation here. We just have to move forward together. I would like to see that happening from the commissioner's office.
You mentioned about acting a little bit more definitively and forcefully. Is there something that maybe Silver and the NBA can take from what the NHL has done, how the commissioner just came out and said, this is our plan, or how, for example, for as divisive as he is, a guy like Dana White of the UFC, I mean, that dude is as forceful and as definitive and as decisive, whether we like it or not. So is there things that maybe the NBA and Silver can learn from the other sports that they can bring with the NBA's approach?
Yeah, I think the NHL is a great example. It doesn't need to be this complicated. It doesn't have to be a 2-week debate about, every single team. Or do they want to be in? Do they not want to be in? And everything else. I mean, look, the bottom line is they need to land this plane, right? They need to get in and get out with the playoffs. Try to have as much TV interest as possible. Try to get a final so that you can crown a champion, because you've crowned a champion every single year since 1947. But the more layers of complexity you add to this, the better opportunity there is to be kind of penny wise and pound foolish, right? You start chasing some of those local TV revenue deals. You start bringing in all these teams that are going to play meaningless games who don't even want to be there. That's going to be bad for your product. It's not going to encourage excitement among fans. And it's also going to increase the risk that somebody important gets sick before the time you get to host the finals. I mean, ultimately, if you add all these different layers to the playoffs, and one of your main superstar level guys gets sick with the coronavirus before you can host the finals, have you shot yourself in the foot by doing all those extra things? I mean, it seems like there's some real value to just keeping this, very slick and simple and as easy as you possibly can make it. And that's what I respected about the NHL. They came right out with the plan. They said, here's how it's going to be. I didn't hear a lot of moaning or groaning after the fact. That was just the new rules, and people move forward. The bottom line is anybody complaining right now about the playoff format, by the time next season rolls around and we're back into preseason or even free agency in the draft, everyone's going to have moved on. They're going to understand. So don't worry so much about the hurt feelings right now, Adam Silver. Just get the job done.
So considering what the NHL did, they're having 24 teams basically go into the playoffs. Is there something maybe the NBA could do maybe with 20 teams, for example, or some other model? Because we know in the Western Conference, the Blazers are mathematically still in if you resume the season right now. We know the Pelicans were a hot team. But other teams, for example, like the Hornets, they're way behind the Magic in the Eastern Conference. So is there a way that the NBA could maybe satisfy the teams that are in contention and maybe do what the NHL did and say, listen, we're going to bring more than just 16 to Orlando to make sure we have open competition?
Right. I mean, my personal preference would be just for a straightforward 16-team bracket. That leaves half the teams almost in the league at home and safe and protected from, potential, risk and health. And I think health should be the top priority. But I think, ultimately what we're seeing here with all these different proposals is that money is the top priority here, right? And I think a major factor is you have a guy like Zion Williamson, who's the biggest draw in the league from a television standpoint, besides maybe LeBron James, who right now is on the outside looking in. And if you could find a way to make a playoff format that includes Zion Williamson, your ratings are going to go way up. You're going to have a lot more interest. And I think that's a major factor here in the league's thinking. And so if you do have a play-in tournament, say with the last 4 seeds, like 9, 10, 11, 12 in the Western Conference, that could allow you to get Zion Williamson. It could allow you to take care of the Portland Trailblazers and Damian Lillard too. So I'm sure there's going to be a lot of interest in that type of proposal. But I just go back to this idea. If you're going to be making all these exceptions and rules, you're also at some point chipping away at your integrity too, right? The more you have to explain why you're doing these different things or why you're modifying things or why this year's bracket looks different than previous brackets, the more you risk having people put an asterisk on your playoffs, having people not take your finals champion as seriously as they might normally take them. And I think that's a real risk from the league standpoint.
Aside from the medical issues and everything else, what do you point to as the greatest risk for the NBA, aside from all the medical and all the precautions that go with that? What is the biggest risk for and against the league resuming this summer?
Well, I think the quality of play issue is a real risk too, right? I mean, everybody's seeing these television ratings for The Last Dance, or for that golf championship over the weekend and saying, man, there's a lot of people are starved for sports. Everybody wants to watch games as soon as possible. And I definitely think that's true. But if the product you're bringing back is going to have suffered from multiple months without basketball, right? It's going to be a really strange situation trying to get these guys back in the gym, taking off the mask, taking off the gloves, letting them play basketball again. There's going to obviously be some apprehension on the players' part of, whether they're going to want to play and, ultimately they're going to get back into the picture. But I just worry about what the quality of play looks like. I mean, if we can get all the way to the end of July and they are back on the court, is it going to look like NBA basketball? Is it going to feel weird being an empty gym? Are the players going to be, 100% in shape and able to stay healthy from a physical standpoint? No hamstring injuries or ankle twists or things like that. That's kind of what I worry about too. And so it's not just this idea of like these guys need to be, protected at all costs from the coronavirus, which I absolutely believe. But it's also, there's a real risk here of, are fans going to get what they expect when it comes to the typical NBA playoffs? And it's a grand show every single year. Goes on for multiple months, 40 days and 40 nights, like they like to say, and all that. It's going to look different once they bring it back, no matter what. And I just worry that, the interest might lag a little bit if fans see a product that doesn't look so great.
Also, before I let you go, Ben, I wanted to ask you, what is the impact also of, let's assume everything goes as expected, and as we would hope for, which is the league resumes at the end of July, the playoffs go to basically the end of September, right? So then your off season would be 2 months, October and November. So what is you think the impact on the league and different teams where if you have a condensed off season, you're coming right back to restart the season at the end of December?
Yeah, it's not ideal, but I mean, that's still a pretty good chunk of time, as long as you're kind of pushing your start back towards the end of December, maybe Christmas. The one positive from the league standpoint is that this was going to be a pretty down free agency period, and it wasn't going to be the biggest draft in the world. And I think that when you're moving those types of events away from that June and July showcase into the heart of football season, in a lot of years, that would make me really nervous if I was the league. But on the positive side here, people aren't exactly like holding their breath to find out where Andre Drummond's going to sign or what he's going to do in free agency, right? It's just not the best class this year. So I think that actually helps them. But in terms of having the players ready to turn back around in December, it's going to be tricky. And there's no doubt these questions are going to linger into next season. Are fans going to be allowed back in the building at any point during the next NBA season? If you delay that season until December, when are you going to play the finals? Is that going to run all the way back in late summer again next year? Does that have another carryover effect for the following year? And that's what I think is so important to keep in mind. I mean, this is not just about resuming basketball here for this summer. I mean, this is really decisions that are going to impact the next 3, 4, 5 years of the league on the court, and then potentially even longer off the court when you're looking at the scope of the economic damage. I mean, we're into the billions of dollars in terms of, lost revenue for the NBA once this thing's all said and done, and that's going to take a while for the league to dig out of.
He is Ben Golliver. Follow him on Twitter at Ben Golliver, Washington Post national NBA writer. Also, check out his podcast, The Greatest of All Talk podcast, as well as all guests he joined us here on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. Ben, appreciate your time here on a Friday, and take care of yourself.
All right, man. Take care.
Josh Hennig here on the warm-up on 97.3 ESPN. I see the texts have been building up throughout the last segment, so we'll get to them coming up next right here. 609-403-0973. Your feedback right here next on 97.3 ESPN FM. And don't forget the 97.3 ESPN mobile app is for free, brought to you by First Bank of Seattle City. Josh Hennig here on 97.3 ESPN. Final segment of the show. Get to your text messages here, 609-403-0973. Reminder, so to come on 97.3 ESPN Sports Bash with Mike Gill and Hunter Brody coming up. Don't forget about football at 4, Andrew DeCecco. Segment powered by InsideTheBirds.com. And more coming up on the Sports Bash. I'm sure they have a lot to talk about with the NBA, Major League Baseball, Phillies, Sixers, Eagles, and more today on 97.3 ESPN. Don't forget tomorrow on 97.3 ESPN. Of course, 10 o'clock every Saturday morning. Billy Schweim in the locker room here on 97.3 ESPN. And I'll be back on tomorrow for Sports Bash Saturday, 12 to 2, right here on 97.3 ESPN. Don't forget 97.3 ESPN.com, the 97.3 ESPN mobile app powered by First Bank of Seattle for all your news coverage of the Phillies, Sixers, Eagles, and Flyers all year long. We got you covered here with our team on 97.3 ESPN FM. Thanks again to Ben Golliver, the Washington Post, for joining us. Of course, if you missed any episode of the warm-up on 97.3 ESPN or the Sports Bash with Mike and Hunter Brody, we have the podcast posted at the end of each day on the website, 97.3ESPN.com, and the 97.3 ESPN mobile app. All right, text messages. I love some of these texts that are coming in. Great conversational points, 609-403-0973. Start with Jason and Kate May says, do you think the Sixers can ever be successful in the playoffs with Ben Simmons not shooting the ball? That's from Jason and Kate May. I would say yes, if. So here's my perspective on Ben Simmons. If somebody else was there to shoot, if somebody else was there to be the person for Ben and Joel to pass to shoot, there'd be less pressure and expectation needed of Ben Simmons to shoot. When you had J.J. Redick and you had Jimmy Butler last year, two guys, one of them's a sharpshooter and one of them's a willing shooter. J.J. is the sharpshooter, Jimmy was the willing shooter. There was somebody else for you to pass the ball to put it in the bucket from outside the three-point arc. I think part of the problem with the Sixers is that all the successful teams in the NBA have multiple ball handlers. The Warriors have Steph Curry and Draymond Green. A team like the Raptors last year, they had Kawhi Leonard, but they also had Kyle Lowry and they had Fred VanVleet. You look at the NBA this year, LeBron James is not the only ball handler on his team. They have Rajon Rondo. They have other guys who can be ball handlers next to him. So one of the big deals, I think, for the Sixers is you're trying to make Josh Richardson into a secondary ball handler, and I don't think that's his skill. I don't think that's his best talent on the basketball court. So if you had another quote-unquote point guard out there with Ben Simmons and you asked him to be more of the point forward in the maybe a modern version of the model of what Scottie Pippen was in the Bulls offense, Grant Hill was in Detroit back in the late 90s, something similar what Draymond Green does with the Golden State Warriors. Also, you look at a team, for example, when LeBron was in Miami, they had Mario Chalmers out there and Dwayne Wade as well. So you technically had three ball handlers when the Heat were going to 4 straight NBA Finals. I think there's a way for Ben to be out there and for this team to be successful, but you need other players out there. And I just don't think that Josh Richardson is that guy to be that secondary ball handler. I think you mean more of a dominant ball handler, which is why I love the next text that came in from Dan from EHT. He says, the Fultz draft was supposed to be the finisher to the process. That didn't happen. And I'm glad Dan brought that up because one of the reasons why Fultz was supposed to be the cap off of the process was because Fultz was supposed to be that other ball handler. Fultz was supposed to be and could have been that point guard. You have a guy who shoots over 40% from three in college, a guy who is now showing that he's slowly coming out of everything he went through over the last few years down in Orlando. He is a legitimate ball handler. He is a legitimate point guard. He can play defense. He can help run an offense. If you had a guy like Fultz, or if Fultz didn't have all the issues he did in Philadelphia, you wouldn't be expecting Ben to shoot as much, and there wouldn't be as much pressure and expectation on him because there is somebody else who can handle the ball, who you can run the offense through like Jimmy Butler did last year. I think if the Sixers could parlay Al Horford and or Josh Richardson into acquiring that secondary ball handler, it would definitely help this team. But because Fultz was supposed to be that guy, and you had to bail on that situation the way the Sixers did, it puts you in a crazy predicament. 609-403-0973 to get on the conversation. Mike from the Villas chimes in and says, the problem is that the Sixers overemphasize defense, and in order to do that, they got rid of all the shooters. You have to have a happy medium. And you're right, Mike from the Villas. One of the problems with the Sixers is that what we saw from them the first 5 games of the season, I think was what the expectation was for this team. This idea this team can maximize it on the defensive end, go full throttle defensively, force teams out of their comfort zone because of their length and their athleticism. And because they were able to get turnovers off of that defense, it allowed the offense to be less dependent on the half-court game. The problem with that system is that, 1, they got away from it, and 2, I'm not sure if this team has enough chemistry and cohesiveness and unselfishness to genuinely maximize that style of play. So you're right, Mike from the Villas. There is a need for a happy medium. There is a need for this team and this organization to put out a basketball team that has a balance between the desire to play defense and having enough shooters and offensive balance around the players that they have to be successful. One of the things that bothers me is the fact that I think that this team was not constructed properly. And whether that's a Elton Brand, a Brett Brown, or a little bit of both, or whatever the issue is, I think this team mishandled the last couple off seasons, and they've put them in a situation where I don't think that the players on this team genuinely complement Ben and Joel. I think Joel's skill set allows this team to do certain things, but it was even better when J.J. Redick was out there. I think Ben Simmons allows you to do certain things, but again, I think it was better when J.J. Redick was out there. I agree with the texters and other people who say, the loss of J.J. Redick has had a serious impact on this team. If you would have kept J.J. but let Jimmy Butler walk, would this team look a little bit differently? I think it's a possibility. I think that if there was a way for J.J. still to be here, and for this team to, instead of maybe going out and getting someone like Josh Richardson, not saying I love this guy, but maybe you would have brought in Goran Dragic instead. You would have had a secondary ball handler, and your lineup would have been Dragic, Redick, Simmons, Harris, Embiid. I think you could have had maybe some sort of balance between the desires of the offense and the defense. But obviously, it's a lot of what ifs, because at the end of the day, we really don't know what would have happened. But what I do know is that I can't wait for the NBA to come back so we can talk about the actual games on the court. And it looks like we're trending in that direction, which is good news for all of us.